Hi everyone, it's Dr. Francis. I hope you're doing well. I just wanted to create this brief screencast on how to interview your source and building your interview protocol, which is the next step in the story creation process. So going to that process, right now we should be at the state where you've found your focus, you've selected your sources, and I know that you worked with your classroom coach in the last session on Tuesday to draft your storyboard, create your media list, and just exchange them and get some feedback from others on that. If some of you are still struggling with a topic or need some additional help, please reach out to me over email. I am on email actively and I'm able to get back to you. If need be, we can set up a call just so that you can keep moving. But today what we're doing is focusing right here on building your interview protocol. And I want to talk to you about how to build that and also some tips on conducting your interview. So when it comes to interviewing, I would ask you if we were in class together, what makes a successful interview? You've probably been interviewed. You may, have conducted interviews with other people. And there are a couple key things that really make the difference. The first thing is that you need to really think about interviewing as assembling the complete picture of what it is you want your final story to look like. All right, so it's thinking with the end in mind, which I have mentioned always since the beginning of class is so important. Always think with the end in mind of what you want your story to look like and have that vision. And your interview is one component of that complete picture. So specifically, how do we get to that big picture? What are some of the good things that you could be doing as an interviewer? There's four things. So it's envisioning the assembled whole, it's building an initial list of key questions, listening actively, reflecting back to others what you're hearing, and asking probing follow-up questions. So let's just dive into them. When it comes to envisioning the assembled whole, the kinds of questions that you should be asking yourself would be, what do I see this story looking like as it comes together? What's the narrative that I'm working to build on here, that I'm working to build out? How does that narrative build through the inciting incident, the building of the conflict or what's going on in the story to the climax, to the resolution, and to the what's next? You should also be thinking about what you want your viewers to leave knowing, feeling, and thinking. And it's not just knowing, but the feeling component, the emotional tug, is really important, and we saw that in a lot of the stories we watched this semester. So what kinds of things could you be doing when you're interviewing your source to help them tell you things that are going to invoke emotion when your audience watches your story? Okay. So how do we accomplish step number one of envisioning the whole and answering these kinds of questions? The things that you should be doing is, of course, do your research, and I know you've submitted some of your research assignments, which is great. That's the first step, doing the research, getting the background information on your source and also on the topic, which could be about the competition itself. Before you go out to interview someone, you should be informed and use that as a base to develop your questions. Also, you want to flesh out the media list and storyboard for your story. So with that completed whole in mind, we want you to build an initial list of key questions you want to ask. So you should use the interview to get some information from your sources that you can't get from other sources. In other words, how the game is played, you could potentially find that somewhere else. If there's background information on your source, you should get that before you go in to interview your source. Just know your source before you go and know the game before you go and talk to your source about this first story of a competition. You should ask short, simple questions. It's not about you doing the talking when you're posing questions, it's really about their response. You should use mostly open-ended questions, and we'll go over that in a second. And then sometimes the best question is the last one. And we'll also talk about what that last one should be. So the action would be for you to compose a list of short open-ended questions for step number 2. And so this is a guide to doing that. Now you can see a lot of these in your textbook in page 162 to 163. But the kinds of open-ended questions you want to be asking are here as question prompts. So why is it that, it's a struggle for you to prepare for this competition? Or why is it that you even want to engage in this competition? How are you feeling about your win or loss? Tell me about what it's like to prepare for this. Tell me what it's like to interact with your teammates. What kinds of things do you do? Describe for me the kinds of things that you do when you're in that mode of trying to get focused. What is it like to, know that you have experienced this loss even after you've worked so hard? Like these questions are going to evoke emotion. They're going to evoke great descriptions from your source, and then you're going to use them to build your story. So the questions that help you build those narrative components are the open-ended ones. They're questions like, well, what were you thinking when this happened? Or how are you feeling as you're doing the preparation? How are you feeling after the win or loss? When the coach was saying this to you, or when another player was saying that, what did you say? What do you remember about the colors, the sights, the sounds, the things you experienced would be important. And then thinking about that closing question, that last question that's always important to ask, of, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you think would be important that I know? That would be something that you should close with, because sometimes it's sort of like the equivalent of closing your reporter's notebook. That's the most important thing sometimes that you can find out, because it's like you didn't think to ask maybe what was the most important thing that they thought you should know. So I've asked this before and gotten great things from my interview sources, and it wouldn't have even been on my radar to ask them. So please make sure your closing question probes if there's anything that you haven't asked them. What do they think you should know? And also I have there in the rectangle, think about your audience. There's an audience of other college students like you, potential employers, other people are going to be watching your work. And so what would they most want to know? If they were sitting in front of your source, what would they ask? So think about them, okay, too. All right, and then we want you to listen actively. So you're going to ask the question, and what's important when you're asking a question, when your source is on mic, when you're recording them, don't do a lot of yep, okay. Make sure when you ask the question, you sit and wait for them to respond and listen to their response. You can nod, but I wouldn't interrupt them, because your sound will be on the recording as well. So anyway, you're listening actively and you're testing for understanding. So what does that mean? When someone says something to you, you want to paraphrase back what they said. So for instance, when someone's talking about how they sustained an injury, you could reflect back to them by saying, so what I'm hearing you say is this injury to your Achilles was something that really changed the way in which you interacted with the team, because now you were on the bench. There was a different way you had to interact with the players. Could you tell me a little bit more of that? So when you're paraphrasing, you're letting the source know that they've been heard, you're testing for accuracy, and then you're also opening it up for, tell me a little bit more about that. That's really helpful, because that gets you to a different level of probing. So listen actively, be silent as you're listening, because you're being recorded too along with your source, but reflect back what you're hearing and use that as an opportunity to dig for more details. And the last thing is, and this kind of goes along with the asking for more details, ask probing follow-up questions. There's something that your source is going to say that you wouldn't have a question written out about. So make sure that you're in the moment, asking them for additional details, additional descriptions, additional feelings, anything like that. You don't have to totally stick to the script. You need to have a script and an interview protocol or an interview question list, but you can go off that, because there's things that you couldn't possibly have thought about asking at that point. So you want to ask more open-ended questions, reflect and paraphrase, and use that as an opportunity to ask deeper questions. One example of that I can bring up would be, Here's a sample interview protocol. I put it on Cabrini Learn. Let's look at how these kinds of questions are built. All right, so here's a probing question that's open-ended. Tell me about your history with soccer. And then beyond that question, where the person is going to be, your source is going to tell you about their history with soccer, right? Then you go into the deep probing. So can you continue by describing what it means to you, how it makes you feel, what it does to you, what it reminds you of from your youth, you know, when you play now, those kinds of things. And then this person for this story was injured. So the question, help me understand, is one of your open-ended questions. Help me understand the surgery. And probing deeper would be, well, did you discover there was a problem? What needed to be done? What were some of the risks and the what ifs that you were thinking about? Question around feelings. How were you feeling before the surgery? What were you feeling after that surgery? Another question that's open-ended, describe for me what playing soccer was like. And then the potential probes going deeper. What was your clearance date? Getting into the details, that's important. Look at the sample protocol too. It's the way I'd like yours to be built. Broadly, right? There's the before competition questions. There's the during competition questions if you have an opportunity to ask your source. If not, you want to ask them these questions coming immediately out of the competition. And then after the competition, what are they feeling? Talk a little bit about that. And then you want to ask the last question that I mentioned, is there anything else I might have missed that you think is important I know? Probe on that, okay? Two initial great questions to start with are, for your source, state their first and last name, spell it, get that on your recording, on your audio recording on iRig. That's important so that you can give them a lower third and spelling everything right when we get into Final Cut. And then please ask them to introduce themselves, first and last name, state their team name or the competition that they're engaged in, and maybe a position or maybe how long they've been at it. It's just as a means of introduction. Okay, so let me go back to this then. Sometimes you're going to ask questions and people are going to give you one-word responses. On page 165 in your text, just going to point you to that. Please make sure that you follow these kinds of instructions. Ask the why question. If they say just a short response, why? Can you say more about that? If you had to explain it to so-and-so, what would you say? Right? Tell me more about that. Please read that portion of your textbook so you're understanding how to get beyond some of the initial Q&A. And then we want you to build a protocol. And so just like I showed you that sample protocol, you want to map that protocol to Freytag's pyramid. What do you want to ask before the competition? What do you want to ask right after the competition? Or right during if you can get it, and then right after. All right, so use the narrative to build the protocol. Okay, we took a look at that protocol, and the last thing to mention is for homework, what I'd like you to do is I would like you to complete the interview protocol. So write one up yourself. Use the sample protocol for Cabrini Learn as your guide. So write your interview protocol for story number 1. Follow the sample protocol as your guide to do that, right? Beginning, middle, and an end. Build it just like that, but have your own initial open-ended questions and your question probes. Please upload that interview protocol by noon on February 13th to Cabrini Learn so I can take a look at it. If there's any other questions I can suggest to you after that time, I will. And then I'd like you to gather your media for story number 1 between the 13th, where now you'll have your questions to do that, and February 18th. Okay, so please begin, if you haven't already, to start gathering some of your media from your media list, your shots, your ambient sound, those kinds of things, and sit down with your source between the 13th and the 18th. Okay, so this was a brief overview on how to build your interview protocol and how to conduct your interview. Happy to answer any more questions about that via email if you want to get in touch with me, but definitely upload your protocol. I can take a look at that when I get home from this conference, and I'll give you some feedback if I think there's additional questions you should ask. All right, everyone, thanks so much. I appreciate you tuning into this screencast, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.